Hello, everyone. Good afternoon. It's a pleasure to be with you all today. I'm just checking to make sure that I can see my fellow panelists here in this space because I can only see myself currently. Calling in from the beautiful Jojage, Montreal today, alongside some of my other panelists. And we have some other ones joining us from. Hello, everybody. Good afternoon.
Hi, great to be here.
Amazing. Just making sure all of our tech is set to go. I think we are. We made it. So good afternoon, everybody, again. Thank you for joining us today. I have the pleasure of calling in from Jojage, Montreal. And I am very privileged to be sitting alongside a really representative panel of leading perspectives on models shaping outcomes-based finance on Turtle Island and that of North America with us today. It's really rare to have such a breadth of accredited practitioners all in one space or sharing a virtual space. If people are moving in and out, panelists, we'll get them back, no problemo. So not to fret. Because it's really rare to have all practitioners because they're so deep in the hard work that needs to get done in outcomes finance. So it's such a gift, and to have all of you gather with us, engage in a critical and hopefully soon to be really productive discussion. So our gratitudes are extended to the Social Finance Forum and Future of Good for allowing us this virtual stage across Canada, across boundaries today and borders to host this talk. And we're excited to be here, I think, and really because we are on the heels of the release of the State of Outcomes-Based Finance in Canada 2023 report, which was co-led by Raven Indigenous Impact Foundation and Sorensen Impact Institute, represented by some of our panelists here today. We're eager to maintain the momentum from this first ever pan-Canadian scan of activity. And because of the nature of the work we do, our aim is not to take this gift of time for granted. So we're going to lean into our general approach, action-oriented and focused on results. We're going to look at some key outcomes of which we're trying to strive towards today in this conversation. We really want our audiences to understand or to get a better understanding of the impetus, the why for outcomes-based finance, its use. We want you to also build connection to the model through working examples in the ecosystem, the how really, and that's going to be talked about through diverse adaptations and applications across geographies, issue areas, and cultural contexts. We're also going to look at identifying key challenge areas and look into key recommendations and opportunities on how to bolster the ecosystem in Canada. So with that, I'll say hello again. My name is Rebecca Waterhouse. I am the principal on the Raven Indigenous Outcomes Fund at Raven Indigenous Outcomes Funds, sitting in a room in Jojage, Montreal, next to my managing partner at Raven Indigenous Outcomes Funds, Jeff Sear. And so I'll ask our esteemed panelists to introduce themselves, a bit about their background, where they're calling in from, and what type of role they play as an actor in the outcomes finance space. And with that, Jeff, I will point to you first.
Okay, so Tanchi Ani Bojo, folks. My traditional name is Kinukino Inane, which means Eagle Man Leading. Hail from small Métis community in southern Manitoba in the Red River Valley. And the question is about the role. So managing partner and founder of Raven Indigenous Outcomes Fund, also managing partner of Raven Indigenous Capital. And what we're about is actually bringing practical systems-wide change into Indigenous communities using outcomes finance and trying to, I would say, write the pathways by which we solve problems in Indigenous communities, both on and off reserve in Canada and the United States. And so how do we go about doing this? What's the tool that we chose to use? And we choose outcomes finance because we believe it fits closely with our values, our traditional values, and the values of Indigenous people and how they want to work in community to resolve complex issues. And it's a short panel clock, so I'll keep that there and turn it over to my colleagues.
Thanks, Jeff. And with that, we will look to Teresa. Please introduce yourself.
Yep, can't hear you.
We can't hear you there, Teresa, if you can hear us. No problem. While Teresa's figuring out her sound there, I will point to Janice, if you can, Janice.
Yeah, thanks, Rebecca. Hi, everyone. It's great to be here. I'm Janice Debno. I'm a managing director at the Sorensen Impact Institute, and I lead the Impact Finance team. Our role in outcomes-based financing is fairly broad. We sometimes play the role of intermediary, where we work with interventions and potential payers to develop projects, structure them, assist in the implementation. In other contexts, we provide technical assistance to other stakeholders seeking to develop outcomes-based financing projects and contracts. And we also help support others in the ecosystem who are committing capital or looking for capital to help them develop an outcomes-based financing approach. And with that, I will hand it back over to Rebecca.
Phenomenal. Thank you, Janice. Happy to have you here today. And Stephen, would you like to introduce yourself?
Thanks, Rebecca, and hello, everyone. Stephen Huddart, sitting around the table from Jeff here, and we're in Jojoge territory, but I live in the home of the Lekwungen-speaking peoples these days in Victoria. I'm the former CEO of the McConnell Foundation, where we were pioneers in introducing outcomes finance to Canada. Not the first social impact bond or the second, but several after that. Worked on the community hypertension bond, which Mars was developed with Mars. Deeply involved in the Winnipeg Boldness, Restoring the Sacred Bond, SIB, and today I'm chairing the board of the YMCAs of Quebec, SIB, on alternative suspensions. So I'll leave it there. Lots to get through today, but good to be here. Thanks.
Good to have you here. Andy, if you may.
Hi, everyone. Greetings from Brooklyn, New York, which is where I am today. I wish I was with all of you in person. I am the co-founder and managing partner at Make Home Capital, where I lead our outcomes financing strategy. Over the last 6 years, we have raised over $110 million to put towards that strategy, where we are partnering with community leaders here in the US to provide flexible, impact-aligned debt to help them achieve the goals and meet the needs of the low-income folks in their communities. A lot of this work for me builds on work I did while at Goldman Sachs, where I had the good fortune to use their capital and also their clients' capital to be the lead investor in some of the first social impact bond investments in the US. And it has been a joy and a pleasure and an honor to get to spend my days doing what I consider to be incredibly important and valuable work as we think about helping to drive impact in low-income communities.
Thank you so much, Andy. And Teresa, do we have you back?
I think so. Can you hear me?
We can.
Okay, excellent. So I'm Teresa Dukes. I'm the Executive Director of the Social Innovation Office, and we're located inside the Government of Manitoba on Treaty 1 and homeland of the Métis. Our position is actually a little bit different, where we act somewhat as an intermediary, but inside government. So often working with a lot of our government partners, because we want to take a different approach to working with community and philanthropy and the private sector to solve complex social and environmental challenges. And often that involves both the tools associated with social innovation and social finance.
Thank you, Teresa. So as the audience can see now, we have such a diverse representation of stakeholders within the outcomes finance ecosystem with us today, and we're going to leverage that opportunity. We're going to anchor ourselves first and foremost in the why. And as such, Janice, I'd like to touch upon your experience and perspective. Your journey into the outcomes-based finance space is really backed by tenure on Wall Street and structuring innovative financial mechanisms. Your vantage point as such is really unique and valuable. Can you help us understand the original purpose of outcomes-based finance as a financial tool, as an innovative financial tool, and what the innovation was and the role it was designed to serve?
Great. Yeah, thank you, Rebecca. So the first couple of outcomes-based financing projects globally really developed organically. But there was one theme that really was a thread through all of them, and that was to change the way in which social services are funded, and a desire to move funding to be associated with activities, not knowing what the outcomes will be, to funding outcomes, and to leverage private capital to provide the working capital so that interventions could be funded up front, and then governments would pay for them when the outcomes are achieved. I think there's so this sort of desire for systems change, essentially, and focus on outcomes, I think, is a theme that that underscores a number of the earlier projects. I can speak specifically to what the purpose, for instance, of the Utah Preschool Social Impact Loan was, which I worked on with Andy while she was at Goldman, and really was the sort of impetus that started really what's a social finance ecosystem here in Utah and in Salt Lake County. And that quite simply was that we were looking for a way to get kids in preschool. We had a very highly effective preschool program, no state funding for preschool, and a ton of kids on the wait list. Very conservative, fiscally conservative legislature. And they weren't completely bought off on funding early education, particularly for low-income children. So there's a lot of research behind the efficacy of investing in young at-risk kids and the savings that accrue to governments when you invest in that kind of prevention. And we were able to identify and quantify what those savings were. And so we developed a model. And again, these projects, early projects, developed organically. We hadn't heard of Petersboro, and Rikers hadn't been launched yet. And what we did is we said, okay, we know there are all these savings. We have a legislature that is very favorable towards public-private partnerships. What if we capitalize those savings and have private money, put up the money to implement preschool, and then the legislature will pay back the private funders with a rate of return, a reasonable rate of return, if our outcome metrics succeed. And that was a model that really spoke to our legislature. So while there were all these benefits around outcomes-based financing, ultimately our purpose was to get kids in preschool and to figure out what is the financial model that's going to accomplish that with a focus on outcomes and really thinking about systems change as to how programs are funded. And one of the benefits is that we had preschool programs that were funded with some federal money here in Utah, but they didn't really track outcomes. But once you tie funding to outcomes, all of a sudden, preschool programs around the state are now tracking their outcomes. And that has been a really significant systems change, because when you track outcomes, you tend to focus on them. And so, of course, this is what's good for kids. I think there are a couple of other benefits around outcomes-based financing, and part of the reason and the purpose. And one is the wrong pockets problem. So oftentimes, so for instance, I'll use early education or maternal health, for instance, as an example. It produces savings in education and health, and some other longer term outcomes. So, governments typically operate in agencies and silos. And so while if you look at the range of benefits, the cost benefit for the program is compelling, right? It's several dollars to one that you put in. But if you look at each specific agency, it may not pencil for the whole program. What outcomes-based financing does is it brings together all these silos to fund outcomes. So we call that the wrong pockets problem, because it's the way government is siloed makes it hard to fund interventions that have broad-based outcomes. I think the other thing, and this is it from a financial model standpoint, I think part of the beauty is that, we have all these problems today that government has to fund through remediation. We know prevention is much more efficient and effective than remediation. It makes sense for governments, it makes sense for the individuals, it makes sense for society. But when you have limited budgets and you have to deal with the problems you have today, it's hard to shift resources upstream to prevention. Outcomes-based financing solves that problem by leveraging private capital to fund the intervention, and then government will pay when these outcomes are achieved. And the association is that the need for remediation is less, so that over the long term, it's either budget neutral or it's budget positive. I think the other piece of it that's also very compelling is the transparency and accountability for outcomes. I think that's been extremely significant, certainly in our state. We now look at funding for social services broadly in a more accountable way for outcomes. And I think we're seeing this sector-wide in terms of foundations and philanthropic funding, that there is much more of a focus on what are these interventions, what is this funding actually achieving. And so, I think that while the purpose in the very early days, there were several themes, but it was very organic in each particular area. And I can speak to, what our purpose was in Utah. But as a systemic change tool, it's very powerful. Back to you, Rebecca.
That rings very loud through, all of the noted benefits of which you've articulated here, Janice. And I think similarly to that, Andy, or similarly to Janice's experience, Andy, your point of entry to outcomes finance was probably, as we would kind of call it, the social side of traditional finance. You were the head of Goldman Sachs' Social Impact Fund and the Social Impact Bond investing at Goldman Sachs. And so you sourced and led signature US social impact bond transactions, such as the first American social impact bond, the Rikers Island social impact bond, of which Janice was referencing. You're now leading the community outcome strategies in the US at Make Home Capital, currently fundraising your second fund. With now having a decade plus of experience under your belt, Andy, what have you learned about the value of outcomes-based finance for people and for governments?
A great question. It's something we've been spending a lot of time thinking about, and I love that Janice talked about that early education project in Utah. When I reflect back over the last 10 years of really doing this work on a daily basis, there are some really clear lessons that we've learned about how to do it better and how to do it faster. I think the why has stayed largely the same, with one important change, which is that early on, there was a real focus on how can we save government money. I think there is a much broader lens where it's not just about saving government money, but it is about driving the benefits of that government spend. And when we think about that benefit here at Make Home, it's not just about what is beneficial to government, but it is also really about the human side of it, is that and the same thing when we think about sort of cost savings. We also think about it on the human cost of an individual taking part in a program, using their time and motivation to get services that don't get them to the outcomes they need. That is also a level of human cost that we think it's important to pay attention to. And I would say the same thing on the benefit side, that it is very important. And a big part of our why is both the system change, but also really about driving better services for individuals. And so that is really part of what we're always keeping top of mind. From a what has changed and what have we learned over the last 10 years, what I would say is a lot of what happened organically on that preschool project in Utah, I would now say we have learned our best practices. So number one is, how can you rely on local leadership and local service providers and local intermediaries to really drive and anchor project development? In that project, we worked with Janice when she was at Voices for Utah Children, as well as the United Way of Salt Lake County. And those two organizations really understood the challenges that families were facing, those families of those 4-year-olds, as well as who were the good providers, and then were well suited to lead the implementation of the project. So that really being grounded in local, we think is really important, and a lesson that has been re-emphasized. The second would be leverage readily available data. I think, again, when we did that project in Utah, we tried to look at what data we had. In many projects in the interim, there was a lot of creating new data. What we have learned is that the best way to get projects launched quickly to meet the really urgent needs in communities is to leverage administrative data that exists, that is really grounded in research and correlated with the long-term results that we need. We often focus on interim, medium-term, and longer-term outcomes with the goal of that kind of transparency and accountability that Janice talked about. We also have really learned that we need to structure our financing in ways that are responsive to the needs of the project. That means we tranche out our funding so we're not burdening we're not letting the financing need drive the car. What we're doing is really saying, what does this project need? When does it need capital? And when is it prepared to pay back principal? And then aligning the structure of our loans with that. I think another big market learning, and this is something that we talk about with the team at Raven, is the benefits of a fund structure. What we know when we're going into a community and we're working with local partners to help develop a new project and help get it launched, we already have the capital in place. And so we can work with them, be doing our due diligence, and then also helping structure an investable project opportunity. What that means is that we are able to meet the urgency of the needs on the ground. Early on, many of the projects, not the Utah project, took years to get off the ground. When I hear that a project took years, all it says to me is we've left people in need. And so we bring that real sense of urgency to our work. So I will turn it back to you, Rebecca.
Thank you, Andy. Lots to unpack there. And I mean, building off of that notion of most critically outcomes-based finance being a really adaptable tool in order to be responsive to project and or community needs. And so, Jeff, let's turn to you for a second. You've worked in service of Indigenous peoples and communities for nearly your whole career, supporting across philanthropic, public, and private capital positions, and now most recently at Raven Indigenous Outcomes Funds. Can you talk to us a little bit about why outcomes-based finance is Raven's mechanism of choice? And what does Raven do in terms of adaptation to the construction of the tool in the Indigenous context to be more responsive?
Sure. Just manage that mic for a second. Hopefully everyone can hear me okay. So I appreciate the question, Rebecca, and I'm listening to Andy and Janice, of course, and we're so very much aligned in terms of how this tool plays out. But the sort of, let's deal with the why question, I think, and it's really important in an Indigenous Canadian and Native American and Native Hawaiian and Alaskan sort of context here. If we think back to the last 200 years approximately of colonization and what has occurred to our people along the way, it means that a whole bunch of needs and services are not being met. They are generally forced downstream from government, usually at a federal government level primarily. And so what you have is an extraordinary mismatch between need and programming kind of content and funding that comes from what would be a responsible statutory agency, for lack of a better word. And so, you know, at the core of the why is we're getting really bad outcomes for Indigenous people. We've consistently got really bad outcomes on any number of issues, from education to social services to climate change, you name it. The outcomes have been basically, all indicators are going, you know, still to this day, somewhat in the wrong direction. So the opportunity, of course, that presents is there must be a way to work differently that kind of matches community cultural values and epistemologies and how we want to work together. And outcomes-based finance is uniquely situated to take on this role, to make a culturally centric approach. And really what we're talking about here, you know, if I was getting to the core of it, we're talking about the United Nations Declaration on the Rights of Indigenous People, the building of self-determined programming. We're talking about reconciliation in Canada and addressing these issues. And what we have, the how, I guess, of it is when Raven goes and works with communities, and all of the requests that we get are inbound to us. We don't go out and proselytize and bring this to communities. They generally hear about a new way of solving problems. We believe that those closest to the problems can solve it the best. Can we put tools in their hands? Can we collaborate, design together, and actually put the community in charge of the intervention? We do this starting in ceremony, and it's fundamentally at its core about relationships and how we're going to work together and how we are going to work together in the long term, because we believe that we start a relationship, it just doesn't necessarily end when the contract ends. It continues on together. So like Andy had mentioned, and Janice, what we do not want to start with is the money. We think the money is secondary, maybe tertiary to the whole issue. What you want to do is sit down with community and say, what are your priorities? What are you trying to achieve? What does success look like for you? And then from out that, we look at the evidence, we look at the community assets, and we build a picture of what we can do together. And then we get into this financial structuring, which is where Raven's skill set comes in. A couple things I want to mention about how these contracts work that's slightly different, or appears to be, at least to me, slightly different in the Indigenous community, is that Raven needs to be very hands-on and provide an extreme amount of capacity built in and around and through an outcomes contract, supports evidence, analysis, upfront design, on-ramping. And then if we can do this, it actually, as an Indigenous financial intermediary in this system, the other thing it allows us to do is to really innovate about how we can do things differently with social finance. And in particular, we use this term at Raven, we want money to act as medicine, to show up differently than it has in the past. But here's an idea of an innovation. We did a first closing at this outcomes fund that we have now last week. We hosted an investment committee, and on the investment committee sits now an elder, which is the first time I've heard of it. But what that allows us to do is to have what we call 7-generation thinking, where we can look to what has happened in the past. How does it match with culture? What's going to happen 3 generations in the future because of this intervention? And would we make a different choice as a result? Would we do and structure things differently? And fundamentally, the answer is yes. We're asking different questions, different long-term outcomes we're seeking. And besides the cost savings to government, everyone else, we're just building better societies that are more resilient and that are basically moving people out of crisis moments and allowing to build this sort of long-term resiliency that allows us to withstand pandemics and to deal with climate change and all the other issues, and then of course to build and grow culture. So that's a pretty speedy, short piece there, Rebecca, but I think I'll leave it there for now.
I'm impressed, Jeff. Thank you for that. And I want to kind of build off of one of the components you said. There's that actors, you know, as they conceive of a role or outcomes finance as a solutions lens, it's really about considering how to show up, how you traditionally show up, and how maybe you need to show up as a responsive lender and or solutions provider for a certain community or for a certain project. And so, Teresa, Manitoba Social Innovation Office is the sole government office in Canada across federal and provincial levels established with a directed mandate to take on an outcomes-based and collaborative approach to connecting innovators in the development of new solutions which align funding to critical areas of need and drive sustainable change. So having structured 4 social impact bonds since 2014 with more in the pipeline, surely we have a lot to learn from your experience and how government is showing up differently in this regard. Can you tell us a bit more about why SIO was conceived and how you perceive and operationalize your role as a government actor in the ecosystem?
Yeah, I mean, I love what the panel has already said. I think a lot of that is exactly the why. You know, I would agree that that we have a big responsibility within government to make sure that our investments are having the greatest impact. And consistent with what Jeff was just mentioning, I think there's some populations, marginalized populations, that are experiencing not the level of outcomes that we would desire as a society. And so I think we had a big interest in looking at becoming more data driven and more outcome focused in our work and in our understanding, and to work a lot more closely with community and philanthropy and industry and in different ways to be able to drive better results. And I guess if you ask me, should others adopt a similar mandate, it might be like really biased for me to say, but I would say, yeah, absolutely. In going through the process of working through 4 different outcomes contracts in different sectors, health, social services, environment, we just see like huge variability in the baselines. And personally, I just learned a lot around what it means to be outcomes focused and data driven, those enablers and challenges of that performance in specific contexts, the assumptions that we have, and the performance of the system. And it's really helped to better understand that gap between community perception and government funding, which helps us to be able to show up in a different way, to have different conversations, and better understanding. So, you know, and all governments are facing the same challenges around financing and the polycrises that are happening. So pulling in and working with different partners in different ways, I think is probably our only pathway forward to making a better future. And the other thing that I will add around it is social finance, when you first enter into it, can be a little bit complicated and full of jargon, and having a space of which government can even begin to understand and enter into that space, so that as the community is moving forward, we can reciprocate, I guess, in our work. I'll leave it there.
There certainly is a lot to learn, Teresa, and I don't think it's bias. I think it's experience. I think it's simply the evidence base, of which is so critical, right? That is informing your understanding of what works and what doesn't, and then continuing on a learning trajectory, right? With that, we're going to talk a little bit about the how. And Stephen, I hope that, you know, as a champion advisor and funder of outcomes-based finance approaches to start here in Canada, you definitely have something to share when it comes to being a key actor in the design and deployment of successful social impact bonds. Can you tell us about how one of the SIBs came together and if it has met expectations, what you've learned about the role namely of community in outcomes-based finance as well.
Great, thanks, Rebecca. You know, it's both a privilege and a challenge to be last in this series of speakers because so much wisdom has already been shared. I'll try and add to what I've heard and just make a couple of points. First of all, I'd just like to add to what my esteemed colleague Teresa in Winnipeg is doing. As I had a chance to visit her shop, and we're talking about a team of a dozen financial analysts, data analysts, program designers, evaluators, an anthropologist who looks at behavioral nudging and so on, and a strategy to work across government and with communities in partnership. This is a powerful constellation of forces that really is generating, I think, outstanding results. And the story I have to tell, the social impact bond that had the greatest impact on me personally and on the foundation when we got involved in it, was the Restoring the Sacred Bond initiative. And this took place in Winnipeg, and it was really by putting trust in a group of Indigenous women to decide when and how they might use this instrument to generate better outcomes for children and families in a very challenged neighborhood, a place where nearly 20% of kids spend time in foster care before they're 5 years old, and in a province where there are 10,000 children in state care. An overly aggressive, if I could use that term, and somewhat dysfunctional child welfare system that is so concerned about not letting situations generate embarrassing headlines for ministers. There's a culture there of getting the child away from the family, away from the mother, in order to prevent something happening. This was where we started, and we started working with Winnipeg Boldness in 2014, and the SIB, if I'm correct, only launched in 2019. So it took that long to build trust. And that's so important in a community-driven approach to this work, which is, I think, vital. And it's where a polycentric governance system, one that represented, where the community organized a system for monitoring and advising its work that included an elders committee, it included parents as advisors, a researcher committee, a funders committee, and an executive director of social agencies committee. So all of those capacities were brought together, and that created the conditions for the iteration, the prototyping, the design of a successful SIB. I don't want to claim any credit for this SIB having influenced that government to create the Social Innovation Office. I would just note that I think Teresa and her group have learned a lot and are building on what we accomplished with that particular social impact bond. But I think I'll just finish by saying that I think this is a really vital and important place for philanthropy to play a role. If we are a catalytic and connective part of the social ecosystem, then it's the perfect place to integrate granting capacities with investing capacity to generate better outcomes for communities. And there's a really, I think, key role here for social learning about how systems really change. So we spent a lot of time talking about the money and the rates of return and so on. It's much more important, I think, to think about the relationships between communities, governments, academics, private sector. This is a tremendous tool, and I really look forward to seeing it grow. And thank you for the report, by the way, Raven and Sorensen. It's going to be really useful.
Phenomenal. I would love to dig into everything of which everyone has said further, and we will have the opportunity because we are friends and colleagues in this ecosystem as it builds out. But what rings through from what everyone said is that these types of financing mechanisms take relationships, they take learning, they take time and trust, and so we recognize that in taking time in the world of finance, that comes at a cost. And it's also then further compounded by other challenges, potential bottlenecks, of which a few of you have already spoken about today. And so what we'll do is a bit of a roundtable here. I'm gonna ask you to essentially look at a potential hurdle from an opportunity lens. So connected it to your biggest pain point as your role or your acting space in this ecosystem. What do you need, and or does the outcomes-based finance sector need in order to deliver more effectively on its original purpose? And so hopefully I can see everybody now. We can go popcorn style. If you want to raise your hand, if you would like to go first. Janice, go ahead.
Sure. So I think there are two things that are both hurdles and potential opportunities. So I think first is really, you need to now compare. And so we need governments to really shift their thinking about how they fund services. And while that is a sticking point right now, because it can take a long time, but it's also a tremendous opportunity because it would affect the system of public funding writ large. And so I think that's when it's a great opportunity. It will help governments think differently about the efficiency of their funds and improving outcomes. And as Andy mentioned, moving beyond cost savings to social benefit. I think the other one is better data collection is a really big sticking point. So we're working on 3 projects here in Utah right now, and some of them with health systems. And it still is always amazing to me that in the public sector and the health sector, you might have good data for some aspects of the health system, and people collect what they have to collect, right? But if we could improve data collection, right, for interventions, for health systems, administrative data, the time we spent trying to figure out what the data says is really mind-boggling. And if we had better data system-wide, we could make much better decisions about how we allocate resources and what the value of those benefits are. Because right now, many of the interventions that we look at have broad-based social impact, even if it's health, for instance. And yet the inability to quantify what that is, even if it's just an estimation, undermines our ability to truly value, particularly the efficacy of prevention, right? Which can sometimes be a long time before you realize some of the benefits. And I think you mentioned, that I kind of grew up in the private sector on Wall Street investment banking. And I often think about, what if the social sector and the public sector and even the health sector had the focus and investment in data that we see in the financial markets? Like what that would mean for improving outcomes in our communities. And so there's a lot of work to be done on both those pain points. But if we were really to invest in it and we were really to see change, I think the transformative impact would be immense.
Can I?
Yeah, please, Andy, go ahead.
So I'm going to quote Janice from last week when Janice, Jeff, and I did a panel, which is, I agree with everything that Janice said as 2 of the sticking points. But what I will also say is we can't let the perfect be the enemy of the good. And where I see the opportunity on both of those sticking points is people like all of us on this panel and everybody we know who are fellow travelers. What I believe the opportunity is to continue to make investments, do the work in communities, and demonstrate the value add of this approach, because I firmly believe that the way government will begin to make outcomes-based contracts business as usual versus like an exception that takes 5 years is because we can point to 5 other people who already did it. And so my view is you unstick things by doing. I would say the same is true of data. If we create contracts that are based on outcomes, if what we do is wait to develop the master data system over 3 years, that then will launch the project, what we all know is the data will be outdated by the time we do that. Instead, create the contract that pays based on outcomes, and you know what? People will create the data systems. Why does the financial system have all those systems? Because they have people who want that data. And so somebody is creating it. And we need to create that same urgency and sense of doing within government and communities and with us as investors. And if we always are worried that this project isn't perfect, we're never going to do anything. And so we have, and I know I'm preaching to the choir because we're all a bunch of doers. So I always say, more leads to more and better.
Absolutely. And Jeff, you just unmuted yourself.
I did because I can't help myself, I guess, essentially. Janice and Annie did a great job of laying out, and I could double down on all that. But there's another interesting pain point that we've run across, and that's the pain point of interjurisdictional outcomes payers. So this, in Canada in particular, and it would be additionally in the United States and in other jurisdictions, especially when we talk about Indigenous or equity serving groups who often have funding and programming from multiple levels of government, municipal, provincial, state, and federal, all at the same time. And it seems to be that we've gotten into jurisdictional wrangling over the last 50 to 80 years amongst governments, who pays for what, fundamentally. That's actually an opportunity space. And we've had a little bit of luck. We have really good, thoughtful government bureaucratic partners who realize that there's a way to get work done sub a jurisdictional conversation where ministers want to yell at each other, whatever they want to do, that you can actually work at a contract level and you can actually stage out, and what we would use as a rate card methodology, but let's say it's a list, who pays for what, you section it out, and now you're getting multiple, because what'll come up is we're taking a break, I guess, is what's happening on the screen at the moment. Anyways, but what'll come up is say, well, look, we're paying for this, but the province is benefiting 60%, but we're paying 100% of it. There is actually a way to create relationships and an opportunity to sit together to get better outcomes across the system for even the purchasers. Never mind for the people, because people they don't live in a jurisdiction. They live amongst different systems all the time, right? And so that's a really strong opportunity space. We've seen it with Manitoba, Teresa and company and others. We've seen it with the Government of Canada in certain agencies and departments. It's not a panacea. It's not everyone shares the same view yet, but we're making strides. We're making progress towards it, I would say. And it's a real opportunity space for us and others.
So with that, we are getting the boot. And so it's been a phenomenal conversation. I will say, learn more, read the report, State of Outcomes Finance 2023. It can be found online by an easy Google search. If not, find Jeff, myself, Janice here, anyone on the call. We're happy to link you and reach out to us. If you are looking at outcomes finance as a solutions lens, we are always happy to build out this pool of doers, and we're actually looking, we're welcoming all those willing to join our space, and so we hope this starts a conversation for you and your teams today. It's been a privilege, and with that, thank you, Future of Good. I'll talk to you guys soon.